Okay, welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about adoption of security capabilities in Prisma Access. My name is Milan Krstic. As you know, this is one in the series of Wednesday evening or morning webinars, depending on the time zone. So far in this winter segment, we've been talking about the new features in Prisma Access 2.2, about ADEM, and about the BPA. Today, we'll be talking, as I mentioned, about adoption security capabilities, and stay tuned for next week's training, which will be a follow-up to this one, where we actually talk about the best practices for using of these security capabilities. In the next 60 minutes, I'll be talking about the cyber attack lifecycle. I'll be talking about how the Prisma Access security capabilities tie into breaking this cyber attack lifecycle. And at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask the questions. And we'll come back to them after in the end of the presentation. Okay, so the cyber attack lifecycle. This is a framework that's used to enhance visibility into attacks and improve understanding on what our adversaries do, how they do it, and how the cyber attack proceeds. This specific framework was created by Lockheed Martin engineers back in 2011. And obviously, this is not the only framework that exists out there. There are many other ones. MITRE ATT&CK, for example, is a very common one. But they basically target the same sort of attacks that we see in the wild today. What's important about the attack lifecycle is that blocking adversaries at any point in the cycle will break the chain of attack. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. As you can see, there's different phases of the attack. Every attack starts with a reconnaissance, follows on with weaponization delivery, followed by exploitation. And then once this happens, the attackers will usually perform installation, some sort of command and control, then finally perform the actions on the objective, which is the whole purpose of their attack. So let's dive into the stages of the attack. Every attack starts with reconnaissance, and it works really much like any other physical attack, like any other burglar and thief or someone who's trying to rob a bank would do. So what they start off is they carefully plan their attacks. They do all the prep work and research in order to identify and select the targets. This can sometimes be using phishing or getting public information from employee LinkedIn profiles or corporate websites. And even though this doesn't seem like a big deal, you can imagine an example of a company website, say, having a career section with job openings. And there could be a job opening for a position in IT or in security. And this job ad will usually say the required experience or desired experience with a particular vendor or a particular networking or security product. And this can indicate to an attacker what kind of protection this company is using just by looking at that. If that's not there, then just looking up some people on LinkedIn will also tell them what kind of experience they have, what kind of departments they work in. So getting names, departments, contacts. There's a lot of information that's publicly or almost publicly available online. So this is where everything starts. It could be as simple as doing a port scan, right? So if it's a targeted attack, the attackers might look up which IPs are being used by their target, or they might just be looking for anything they can get that's open and vulnerable. So they might be doing a large-scale internet sweep looking for vulnerable hosts, vulnerable applications that can exploit. So what can we do to prevent this? Obviously, the information that's publicly available, there's not a lot that Prisma Access as a solution can do, right? If the information on LinkedIn is public or on the corporate website is public, it is where it is. But the social engineering part, where someone might be specifically targeting particular individuals, can be blocked using URL filtering. And then any sort of vulnerability probes can be protected with vulnerability protection. In case of Prisma Access and the reconnaissance stage, this most often would reflect on inbound connections. So if that's being used, this is where vulnerability protection really comes into play. Right, so when the attacker selects their target, they will determine which methods they want to use. There's many different methods, and the attackers will obviously try to use one they think that has the highest chances of success. It could be just a PDF or a Word document, or something that looks like a PDF or a Word document inside of an email message. And depending if it's highly targeted, it may actually be very, very, very specific. So if a specific individual is working in accounts payable, it could be an invoice. And also it could be an invoice in the name of a partner that they normally work with, so that everything looks like business as usual. So it would make it very likely for the attachment to be opened or for the instructions in the email to be followed. There's quite a lot of different things we can do at this stage. For start, visibility is very important. We want to provide visibility to all traffic by using app ID and SSL decryption. When it comes to visibility for app ID, that more or less comes out of the box. Even if app ID is not used in security policies, the traffic will still be visible, the logs will still show, and the reports will still show the actual applications being used. But what's really important for visibility is SSL decryption, because app ID is only limited to what the firewall can see. If the data is encrypted, most of the data is hidden behind the SSL encrypted traffic, which is why SSL decryption is very, very important and should always be used. Once we have the visibility, then we can block the high-risk applications using app ID. So this is a first step in reducing the attack surface. So blocking unused or unwanted or high-risk applications reduces the attack surface by quite a lot. The next step would be blocking malicious and risky websites, such as hacking or phishing or malware, and many more categories that can be blocked by using URL filtering. So if web browsing is allowed, we can use URL filtering to narrow down the available URL categories and reduce the attack surface even more. So if, for example, a particular website is allowed, the next step for reducing the attack surface is file blocking, where we can block the risky file types using the file blocking feature. This is again very useful in reducing the attack surface, because if in some circumstances we don't want, for example, high-risk websites to be allowed to download executable files, we can create a policy rule that blocks executable files being downloaded for such sites. So it's very important. It is maybe a fairly crude feature because we're blocking entire file types. But again, if we block executables from high risk or from newly registered websites, that goes a long way towards reducing the attack surface. Then we can block known exploits using vulnerability protection. A vulnerability protection will have signatures for known exploits and block any of those exploit attempts. Coming down to files again, if the file type is allowed, for example, it might be a perfectly legitimate website or a legitimate file type, then our antivirus and wildfire signatures will kick in, and they will look at those files. For example, if the executables are allowed, the firewalls and Prisma Access will look into these files using antivirus and wildfire signatures and try to stop the bad files from going through. Antivirus and wildfire signatures come from malware that wildfire has seen and analyzed, and that we've known from before. And when I say before, it could be just 5 minutes ago. But when it comes to unknown malware, we have wildfire inline machine learning component. Wildfire inline machine learning component does not rely on signatures. It relies on the machine learning model, and by virtue of that is able to stop even zero-day malware without the need for sandbox analysis first. So it's a very powerful last layer of defense in this case. And then finally, unknown malware will be sent, or unknown samples will be sent to Wildfire. Wildfire will analyze it. The cloud sandbox solution will analyze the malware and then deliver protections globally through all of these features. So if we see malware coming from a bad website, we'll mark it as malware with URL filtering. We'll generate signatures for antivirus and Wildfire. If we see some traffic being used for C2, will generate appropriate signatures. So Wildfire covers all of these. Okay, in exploitation phase, we were not able to stop the attack vector. So let's say that if it was a PDF file that was sent via email, it was not stopped, and the attacker has a chance to exploit the endpoint. This can happen in many different ways. For example, it could be an executable file that looks like a PDF. So when a user double clicks it, it actually runs some bad code and does what the attacker wants to do. But in some cases, it could be PDF that's using maybe a zero-day vulnerability in the email client or in the PDF viewer or in the Adobe Reader. So it might actually be a document, and all it takes is for the user to open it. So this is where the exploitation happens. This step happens entirely on the endpoint, right? So the file or the email, the sample in question has already traversed the network. It's on the end user's workstation, PC or Mac or even a mobile phone. And at this step, it has traversed the network, and the network cannot do anything to stop the exploitation. However, Cortex XDR is a product that can do this, because Cortex XDR runs on endpoints and blocks both known and unknown vulnerability exploits and malware. So it has features that detect exploitation attempts and patterns, and it also has features that protect from the actual malware that does not necessarily need to use exploitation. And Cortex XDR also works with Wildfire. So all the samples that it's not sure about, it'll send to the Wildfire cloud for deeper analysis. Again, excuse me, this step happens on the endpoint. So at this step, Prisma Access does not really help, because at this point, the malware file is on the endpoint itself. But it's useful to know that Cortex XDR is something that can help with this. Right, so after the bad code is executed, either through exploitation or by tricking the user into running the software, there's a couple of things that the attackers want to do with their code. One of the most important things for them is, for example, to establish persistence, which means they want their malware to persist after log off and log on or after reboot. And the reason for this is because maybe the first time they tricked the user into running it, maybe the first time there was a vulnerable version of software that they were able to exploit to run their code. But the next time around, the user might be more suspicious, or there could be a Windows update or a software update that closes the vulnerability that was used before. So they want to make sure that if their code is running, it's going to remain running. Usually this means putting a file somewhere in some hidden folder and making sure that there's a link in registry to auto run it on the next boot. But as I mentioned, they also want to hide it, right? So they might use a rootkit, which will entirely hide the file from the file system, so it's not even visible with any of the regular tools that you would normally use. And they also want to establish privileged operations, so to escalate their privileges. The reason for this is maybe they have what they've done is they have compromised a regular user that does not have administrative privileges. So in order to, for example, dump the memory of the machine or do further exploitation, they might need administrator or root privileges. So this is one of the things they want to do. And then also, when it comes to the further steps, having privileges of a network administrator or from another sort of administrator across the network usually gives them much better opportunities for further steps if they can do it here, right here on the workstation they have taken control of. So again, this happens on the endpoint, and again, not a lot of things that Prisma Access itself can do here. But as I mentioned, Cortex XDR is a really strong player here, because local exploitation that can lead to either privilege escalation or password theft, with tools such as Mimikatz, can be detected by Cortex XDR. And Cortex XDR can also prevent malware from accessing certain OS functions that it frequently uses, can detect different sorts of malware, ransomware, and also if there's some unknown samples that Cortex-XDR is cannot detect whether they're malicious or not, it will send them to the Wildfire sandbox to create additional protections. Okay, moving on to step 5, command and control. This is something that's very common. It's not always present, but in most cases, and in targeted attacks as well, it's almost always there. The attackers want to establish some sort of a command channel back to them so that they can control the malware that's running on the exploited machine or on the machine where they were able to infiltrate. The reason for this is there's multiple reasons for this. One of them is if they don't use command and control, they might not know whether their attack was successful or not. They might not know if their software or their malware is running on the infected machine. So they definitely want to know that, and they want to be able to control the malware to do the other objectives that they have. So they very often want to get in touch with that malware. Very far back in history, this used to happen by malware listening on a particular port on the endpoint, and then the attackers would connect. But obviously, in the days of firewalls and network segmentation, this is very difficult. So what most command and control connections do, or most types of malware do for command and control, is they actually initiate the connection from the infected endpoint back to the attacker's server, because these connections are typically more likely to succeed. And in terms of that, it's in their interest, in the attacker's interest for these connections to succeed. So they try to use the type of communication that's most likely to be allowed in the network. So they will usually use web browsing, so port 80 or 443 classic HTTP towards the internet, because most often that's something that's allowed from most networks to the internet. And in some cases, they might even simply use DNS, because DNS is, again, one of those things that are almost guaranteed to go in and out of the network when it comes to replies. So what do we do to stop command and control? Anti-spyware is the most powerful tool that Prisma Access has to stop this. Anti-spyware has different modes of operation. One of them is the pattern signatures. The pattern signatures target the command and control patterns, right? So it looks into the traffic itself that's used for command and control and the patterns used by this traffic, and it tries to detect and stop them. And in doing that, it focuses on the pattern, and it doesn't rely on, let's say, the domain name or a URL or something like that. So it's pretty much versatile because it looks at the pattern itself. Next to the patterns, we have DNS security and DNS signatures, which target DNS traffic and look at domains being used in DNS traffic. DNS signatures are something that's updated on a regular basis, whereas DNS security is a full-blown cloud service where the Prisma Access firewalls will query the cloud service for each domain they need to check. And then the cloud service has additional logic on top, running on top. Machine learning is being used to correlate all these queries and to detect suspicious behavior and to assign appropriate category to all these domains that the hosts are trying to resolve. If DNS security or DNS signature detects a bad domain, there are different actions that can be taken. Drop is a very common one, but DNS syncal is actually something that we recommend, where instead of dropping the DNS request with a suspicious domain, the firewalls actually create a fake response and send it back to the querying client, and the fake response will contain a sinkhole IP. What happens next is usually the infected client, once they get this sinkhole IP, they will try to connect to this sinkhole IP. And then connection attempts to these sinkhole IPs will be visible in the traffic logs and are something that can be used for tracking. Why is this important? Well, the most important thing is visibility. It depends really on the way DNS is used in a particular network. But if there are users that are behind the DNS server, let's say on a remote network, you might have users, they may have a DNS server that's on site. they may query the local DNS server for caching purposes. And then this local DNS server might be doing out the queries to the internet, which are protected by the firewall. So in this case, if there is a suspicious query, the source IP of the suspicious query will be the DNS server. And we will not have the visibility into which client actually has performed this suspicious query. And this is very important because if you think about it, at step 5, command and control, if we're here and this happens, it means that the attacker has already exploited the endpoint. And this is a very, very sensitive thing. This is something that the security operations might want to know about, might want to investigate. And then if we just give them the source IP of the DNS server, that won't help them a lot. Obviously, the DNS server could have logging enabled, and we might be able to correlate the logs on the DNS server, but that's not always the case. This is why using sinkhole is really important, so that we get the visibility of which host exactly is trying to resolve the suspicious domain, because at this stage in the life cycle, this is very important information that probably needs to be investigated. If we go through the DNS and the DNS sinkhole or the spyware patterns don't block the DNS query, as I mentioned, the malware will then try to establish the connection. This is where now, again, URL filtering comes into play, because if we're connecting to a non-malicious URL or a suspicious URL, URL filtering will block it. However, we might see malware that's using some completely new method of communication that we haven't seen before. It might not be HTTP, it might not be DNS, it might not be any of the known protocols, right? It could be something that these attackers have created from scratch and something that we haven't seen before. This kind of network traffic that doesn't conform with any application will be detected by Prisma Access as unknown TCP and unknown UDP. So if the traffic is unknown, if it's something we haven't seen before, we can block this traffic. So we can block the unknown traffic that we haven't seen before to cover this last use case where the attackers might be using a custom sort of protocol or custom sort of communication method that we don't have visibility into. Okay, actions on the objective is the last step in this framework. And at this step, as we've covered everything, the attacker has performed the reconnaissance, was able to deliver the payload to the endpoint, to exploit the endpoint, either by user running the code or exploiting a vulnerability on the host. They established the command and control channel, which basically means they have full control of this endpoint. What happens next, it depends entirely on what the attacker was planning. Most of the times, the motivation is profit, money, right? But not always. Sometimes they might just be looking to cause some damage, right? It could be politically motivated, the so-called hacktivism. They might just be trying to get some message across, or it could just be an act of sabotage where they're just looking to cause damage without actually getting any maybe ransom or any value back out of it. So what happens next really depends on the particular attack, on the particular target, and what the attackers are planning to do. What we can do in this case is we can use file blocking and data filtering, or the DLP subscription, to prevent uploading sensitive data. What does this mean? If we have a file server, maybe a SharePoint server, which contains a lot of sensitive documentation, there should be no files coming from this server to the internet, because that might be data exfiltration. Obviously, as I mentioned before, file blocking is somewhat crude here because it works on file types, but then data filtering and DLP are much more sensitive to patterns and other things that might be found inside these documents, and can be much more fine-grained when it comes to preventing sensitive uploads and exfiltration. And then also, we always want to block outbound communication to known malicious URLs with URL filtering, because if they want to exfiltrate data, they might use HTTP or any sort, or SSL even, right? And if we have URL filtering enabled and we block the suspicious and malicious URLs, that will be stopped as well. There's one more bit that's not covered by the Lockheed Martin kill chain, but I feel it's necessary to mention it, and that's lateral movement. Lateral movement means that when an attacker compromises one endpoint within a network, they will very frequently try to move from that device to other devices within the same network. The reason for this is because usually when security is designed, there's usually something called a perimeter, right? And there's a lot of security involved when crossing these perimeters. So you might need to go through a firewall or multiple firewalls, or maybe even a proxy, or there's a lot of steps in between that protect different applications and different services. However, once you cross the perimeter and once you get inside of the network, jumping, for example, from one laptop in the office to another laptop in the office, or from one server in a DMZ to another server in a DMZ, will typically have much fewer protection layers or levels involved, and it might be much easier to move laterally through the network once they're in, rather than trying to get in from the outside every time. So once they're in, they'll typically try to move left and right in the network where the compromised endpoint is. And this is obviously very important, even though it is at a late stage. Protecting and detecting lateral movement will help prevent attackers from fulfilling their objectives, and will help detect the attack. So what we really want to do here is we want to establish secure zones and move towards zero trust model as much as possible. For example, if you think about lateral movement between laptops in an office, that is pretty clear. They're probably the same VLAN connected to the same switch, and there's 0 to none protection between them. But for example, if you think about Global Protect and the endpoints connected to the Global Protect, every traffic between them needs to pass through a firewall, which applies all the possible features and protections we've just discussed. So the way to combat lateral movement is network segmentation and zero trust. We want to make sure that there are no trusted hosts and trusted concept, that all traffic is protected by firewall or by Global Protect. For example, if there's a host accessing a server which has sensitive data, we always want to protect that communication, even though the host is trusted, might even be in the office physically at the same place where the data center is. This endpoint can at some point become compromised, and it might even not be from the outside. Endpoints can become compromised from the inside by means of either an infected USB stick, or maybe a disgruntled employee, or something like this. I'm sure everyone has heard about some bad actors offering Tesla employees huge amounts of money if they would just install some malware onto the network. So in terms of this, one can never know. Any endpoint can potentially be compromised, and no, or as little as possible traffic should be considered trusted. So zero trust is the way to go here to protecting lateral movement. And then once we have the segmentation and the prevention in place, we can use the same methods that we use in weaponization delivery prevention. So all these methods, FID, vulnerability protection, antivirus, all these methods will work. It's just important that this traffic and these traffic flows are protected by Prisma Access firewalls or other on-prem firewalls. Okay, this is what we want to talk about today. So I talked about the adoption of security capabilities, how they fit in with the attack lifecycle, so why it's important to use them, how they can stop the attacks. And next week, at the same time, we'll be talking about best practices for using these security capabilities. So it's usually not just enough to switch them on. We have to think how to configure them so that they are effective to their maximum potential.